All right, so you guys really want to talk Jeffrey Dahmer. Well, buckle up because we are diving deep into a dark chapter. But the real question here, the question we're going to kind of try to explore is, could any of it have been prevented? Dahmer is known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, which is terrifying, but let's go beyond the surface and see what we can learn from this whole case, not just about Dahmer himself, but about the systems and the society that allowed him to operate for so long.
It's one of those cases that just continues to resonate, I think, because it forces us to confront some really unsettling realities
Yeah.
about human nature
Yeah.
and cracks in our safety nets.
Absolutely. So let's start right at the beginning. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee in 1960. Now, I know the troubled childhood trope gets thrown around a lot, but in Dahmer's case, there are some specifics that really stand out. His parents' relationship was incredibly volatile. They ultimately divorced, and that kind of instability, I mean, we all know, can have a profound impact on a child's development.
Absolutely. There's a whole field of study around attachment theory and how these early childhood experiences, especially within the family unit, can shape a person's emotional and psychological well-being. In Dahmer's case, you know that instability may have fostered really deep feelings of neglect and isolation, and these early experiences can, in some cases, lay the groundwork for maladaptive behaviors later in life.
So we're not just talking about, you know, feeling sad or lonely. We're talking about potential long-term consequences for mental and emotional development.
Right. It's like a foundation that's been cracked.
Yeah.
And those cracks can widen over time, especially if other stressors or traumas are introduced.
And there were other early signs, too. Dahmer was fascinated by biology and anatomy, even as a kid. I mean, some might call it foreshadowing. But how much can we really read into that?
It's really difficult to say with certainty. You know, a lot of children are naturally curious about the world around them, including the human body.
Yeah.
But in Dahmer's case, this interest, coupled with his increasing social withdrawal, could be seen as an early indication of an unhealthy fixation.
You mentioned social withdrawal, but he wasn't the stereotypical croupy loner, was he? Didn't he maintain a relatively normal outward appearance?
Yeah, that's one of the most unsettling aspects of this whole case. Dahmer could blend in, which really challenges the common perception
Yeah.
that we can easily identify dangerous individuals based on outward appearances.
So what you're saying is someone could be harboring these dark thoughts, even engaging in disturbing behaviors, and we might not have a clue just by looking at them.
Precisely, and that's why understanding the psychology of these individuals, the warning signs, the potential triggers, is so crucial.
Okay, so Dahmer's a teenager. He's already showing some troubling signs, and then he starts abusing alcohol. I mean, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire, right?
It's more accurate to say that substance abuse often acts as a catalyst. It lowers inhibitions, exacerbates pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities. It can also serve as a coping mechanism, a way to numb difficult emotions or escape from reality.
So we have this young man already struggling with potential trauma and isolation, and now he's adding alcohol to the mix. And then in 1978, at just 18 years old, he commits his first murder.
This is a pivotal moment. You know, that first act of violence, taking a human life. It's a profound transgression. In Dahmer's case, he picked up a hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks, and brought him back to his home, where he bludgeoned him to death. It's chilling how this initial act set a pattern for his future crimes.
Yeah, it's like a switch flipped, and there was no going back.
And yet, what's really interesting is there's this long gap between his first murder and when he begins killing again in 1987. Almost a decade. What do we make of that?
Yeah, what was he doing during his 9 years? Was he trying to suppress his urges? Or did something happen that reignited them?
That's a question that has fascinated researchers for years. Some theorize he may have been engaging in deviant behaviors that went undetected, maybe even honing his methods. Others believe he was actively trying to resist his darker impulses, perhaps using alcohol as a way to numb or suppress them. It's a period that remains somewhat shrouded in mystery.
It's unsettling to think about what might have been happening during that time. But in 1987, the killings resume, this time in Milwaukee. And this is where his MO really starts to take shape. He begins targeting individuals in social settings, often gay men, and luring them back to his apartment.
And that predatory aspect becomes a hallmark of his crimes. He was playing on people's trust, exploiting their vulnerabilities. He was a master manipulator, able to present a facade of normalcy that disarmed his victims.
It's terrifying to think that someone could be so calculating, so deliberate in their deception. And it went on for years, this horrifying pattern of luring, killing, and, well, we know what happened in that apartment. But it wasn't until July 22nd, 1991, that things finally came to a head. One of his intended victims managed to escape.
Yes, Tracy Edwards. He was able to break free from Dahmer's apartment and flag down police. It was a truly pivotal moment in the case because it finally exposed Dahmer's crimes and put an end to his reign of terror.
You mentioned Dahmer's apartment. When the police searched it, they found, well, it's the stuff of nightmares, right?
The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs of dismembered bodies, preserved body parts, tools used for his gruesome acts. It painted a horrifying picture of the depravity that had been taking place behind closed doors.
And I imagine that's what really shocked the world. Not just the brutality of the crimes, but the fact that they had been happening right under everyone's noses for so long. It makes you wonder, how could this have gone undetected for years?
That's where we have to look at the systemic failures, the missed opportunities. That allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes. There were several instances where people reported suspicious activity at his apartment, but their concerns were dismissed.
You mentioned missed opportunities. I understand there was even a case where one of his victims almost escaped, months before Tracy Edwards.
That's right. Conorak Synthesumphone, a 14-year-old boy, managed to escape Dahmer's apartment in May of 1991. He was found wandering the streets, naked and disoriented. But when the police arrived, Dahmer convinced them that Conorak was his adult lover and that they were just having a domestic dispute.
You're kidding. The police actually believed him.
Tragically, they did, despite the pleas of neighbors, who insisted the boy was underage and clearly in distress. The police escorted Conorak back to Dahmer's apartment.
It's heartbreaking to think about what happened next. They were so close to stopping him.
It's a chilling example of how implicit bias can have devastating consequences. Many of Dahmer's victims were young men of color, and their disappearances didn't seem to generate the same level of concern or urgency as those of white victims might have.
So we're talking about racial bias, potentially homophobia as well, and a general lack of concern for marginalized communities.
Absolutely. Dahmer's case exposes those societal blind spots, the ways in which prejudice and indifference can allow predators to operate unchecked, especially when their victims are those society deems less worthy of protection.
It's a harsh reality to face. So Dahmer's finally caught, the evidence is overwhelming, and he's put on trial in 1992. What was the legal strategy at that point?
Dahmer's lawyers made the decision to plead guilty to 15 counts of murder. This avoided a lengthy and emotionally draining trial, but it also robbed some of the victims' families of the opportunity to see the full legal process play out.
That makes sense from a logistical standpoint, but I imagine it also raises ethical questions. Is a plea deal ever truly justice, especially in a case this horrific?
It's a complex issue. A plea deal can expedite the process and ensure a conviction, but it can also leave victims feeling like their voices weren't fully heard, that the punishment doesn't fully match the crime. It's something that's still debated in legal circles, especially for cases of this magnitude.
And Dahmer ultimately receives multiple life sentences. But what did that actually look like for him on a day-to-day basis?
Life in prison for Dahmer meant maximum security. He was isolated, under constant surveillance, with very limited contact with other inmates. It's the kind of confinement reserved for the most dangerous offenders, designed to minimize any risk of escape or further violence.
So even though the trial was over, his punishment was ongoing, in a way. And during the trial, his mental state was a big point of contention, right?
Absolutely. His lawyers argued for diminished capacity, claiming he wasn't fully in control of his actions. But multiple expert witnesses testified that Dahmer was in fact aware of the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. He exhibited planning, control, and deliberate attempts to conceal his crimes.
That makes sense, legally. But on a human level, it's still hard to grasp how someone could commit such heinous acts and be considered sane.
It highlights the complexities of the insanity defense. You see, it's a legal concept, not a medical diagnosis. The question isn't whether someone has mental illness, but whether they understood the wrongfulness of their actions at the time of the crime. And in Dahmer's case, the evidence suggested he did.
So even though he was undoubtedly a deeply disturbed individual, he was still held accountable for his actions. Did he ever express any remorse for what he did?
He did. In prison, Dahmer gave interviews where he spoke about regret and even turned to religion. But it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to truly gauge the sincerity of those claims.
It's one of the most haunting aspects of this case, right? We're left grappling with the question of whether someone capable of such horrific acts can ever truly feel genuine remorse.
And it forces us to confront our own limitations. In understanding the depths of human darkness, we want simple answers, clear-cut explanations. But sometimes, The truth is far more complex and unsettling.
And then in 1994, Dahmer is killed by another inmate. It feels almost inevitable, given the nature of his crimes.
It's a tragic ending, but one that speaks to the brutal realities of the prison system. Dahmer was a high-profile target, someone who had committed acts so heinous that they defied comprehension. While no one deserves to die, it's sadly not surprising that he became a victim of violence himself.
It raises questions about our penal system, doesn't it? Is it truly about rehabilitation, or is it more about punishment and retribution?
It's a debate that continues to rage on. Dahmer's case highlights the complexities of seeking justice and balancing the need for accountability with the potential for redemption. It's a conversation that we as a society need to have.
So we've talked about the crimes, the trial, the prison system, but this case is about so much more than just one man. It's a stark reminder of the systemic failures that allowed Dahmer to operate for so long.
Precisely. Dahmer's case forces us to look beyond the individual and examine the societal factors that contributed to his crimes.
Let's unpack that a bit. What are some of the specific lessons we can glean from this case?
Well, I think one of the most glaring takeaways is the importance of mental health awareness. Dahmer's troubled childhood, his social isolation, his substance abuse, all of these were red flags that potentially could have been addressed.
So we're talking about early intervention, recognizing the signs of potential trouble before it escalates to something horrific.
Exactly. We need to create environments where people feel comfortable seeking help, where mental health issues aren't stigmatized, but rather addressed with compassion and understanding.
That's crucial. And it's not just about professional help, it's about community support, creating networks of care and concern so that individuals don't feel isolated and alone.
Right. It's about fostering a culture of empathy and understanding.
And what about the systemic failures we discussed earlier? The issues of racial bias and police negligence? What can we learn from those aspects of the Dahmer case?
We have to acknowledge the role that prejudice and indifference played. In allowing Dahmer to continue his crimes for so long, many of his victims were marginalized individuals whose disappearances didn't receive the attention they deserved.
It's a harsh reality, but one we can't ignore. It's about recognizing our own biases, challenging systemic inequalities, and demanding accountability from those in positions of power.
Yes. And it's about empowering marginalized communities, giving them a voice, and ensuring that their safety and well-being are prioritized.
We've talked about mental health awareness, systemic bias, but there's another important element to consider, right? The victims and their families.
Absolutely. Dahmer's crimes had a devastating impact on the lives of countless individuals. Their pain and suffering cannot be overstated.
Their stories need to be heard, their memories honored.
And it's important to remember that they are not just statistics or footnotes in a true crime case. They were real people with hopes, dreams, and loved ones who were left shattered by Dahmer's actions.
And did any specific advocacy efforts emerge from this case in terms of supporting victims and their families?
Yes, in the aftermath of Dahmer's arrest and conviction, many victims' families became vocal advocates for justice and community safety. They pushed for changes in law enforcement procedures, better resources for victims of crime, and greater awareness of the warning signs of predatory behavior.
So they channeled their grief and anger into something positive, trying to prevent others from experiencing the same pain.
Precisely. They turned their personal tragedies into a force for change, working tirelessly to create a safer and more just world.
It's a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, there can be hope and resilience.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit and our capacity for compassion and healing.
And it speaks to the importance of collective action, of coming together as a community, to support those who have been harmed, and to work towards preventing future tragedies.
Exactly. Dahmer's case is a stark reminder that we're all interconnected, that the choices we make, the actions we take, can have a profound impact on the lives of others.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the specifics of Dahmer's crimes to the broader societal implications. But there's one more aspect I wanted to touch on: media ethics. How do we balance the public's interest in such horrific cases with the need to respect the victims and their families?
That's a crucial question. Cases like Dahmer's often become media sensations, but we have to be mindful of the way these stories are told.
It's easy to get caught up in the true crime element, the shock value. But we can't forget that real lives were lost, real families were devastated.
Exactly. Sensationalism and graphic details can exploit the victims and their families, and can desensitize us to the real human cost of these crimes.
So it's about finding that balance between informing the public and avoiding gratuitous exploitation. Has media coverage of true crime evolved at all since the Dahmer case?
I think there has been some progress. There's a growing awareness of the need for sensitivity and ethical considerations. Some documentaries and podcasts are doing a good job of giving voice to the victims and exploring the systemic issues that contribute to these tragedies.
That's encouraging. It's a sign that we're becoming more thoughtful in the way we consume and process these difficult stories.
And it highlights the potential for media to be a force for positive change, to raise awareness, to promote empathy, and to spark dialogue about difficult but important issues.
All right, we've explored a lot of dark territory in this deep dive. We've talked about Dahmer's crimes, the missed opportunities to stop him, the systemic failures that allowed him to continue, the need for mental health awareness, victim advocacy, and ethical media coverage. It's been heavy, no doubt, but I think it's been an important conversation to have. We can't just shy away from these dark corners of human behavior. We have to confront them, learn from them, and work to create a world where such tragedies are less likely to occur.
I couldn't agree more. The goal isn't to dwell on the darkness, but to use these stories as a catalyst for positive change.
And that brings us back to the question we posed at the beginning of this deep dive. Could any of this have been prevented? Knowing what we know now about Dahmer, about the systemic failures, the missed opportunities, what steps can we take to make a difference?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and unfortunately there are no easy answers. But I think it starts with awareness. We need to educate ourselves about the warning signs of predatory behavior, mental illness, and systemic bias. We need to be vigilant, not just for ourselves, but for our communities.
So we're not just talking about being aware, we're talking about taking action.
Exactly. It's about being an active bystander, not a passive observer. If something feels wrong, speak up. Don't be afraid to challenge authority, to demand accountability. Remember, Conrac's synthesophone's neighbors did speak up. They tried to alert the police, and their voices were ignored, with tragic consequences. We need to make sure those voices are heard.
It takes courage to speak up, especially when you're going against the grain or questioning authority. But you're right, silence can be complicit.
And it goes beyond just reporting suspicious activity. It's about advocating for better systems, supporting organizations that work on mental health awareness, victim advocacy, criminal justice reform, voting for policies that address these issues. These are all ways we can contribute to creating a safer and more just society.
Because ultimately, this isn't just about one killer. It's about creating a culture that's less tolerant of violence, more supportive of those who are struggling, and more equitable for all its members.
Precisely. Dahmer's case is a stark reminder that these issues are interconnected. We can't address one without tackling the others.
So this deep dive has been a call to action, really, to be informed, to be engaged, to be the change we want to see in the world.
It has. And while the darkness of this case will always be with us, so too should the lessons we've learned. We owe it to the victims, their families, and ourselves to create a better, safer future.
And we owe it to ourselves to remember that we're not powerless. We can make a difference, even in small ways, by being more aware, more compassionate, and more active in our communities.
I think that's a powerful message to leave our listener with. This case, as horrific as it is, can serve as a reminder of our shared humanity and a responsibility to look out for one another.
So to our listener, we leave you with this final thought. What will you do with this knowledge? How will you use it to make a difference in your own corner of the world? Because the fight for a safer, more humane society continues. And it's a fight we must all take part in.